Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I am speaking with Sinead. I started following her on Twitter. You can find her at I am Watson. And I became aware of her because her account got suspended. And then it came, then Twitter brought her back. So she talks about transitioning and detransitioning. I'll post a couple of links to videos and interviews she's done other places in the description. Hey Sinead, thank you for coming on.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So um like I mentioned, you've detransitioned, and there's I mean, this is like a lot in the media nowadays. But I don't want to like spend too much time talking about your story because I know you've got other interviews and I'll post links to them. But if you want to just give a brief, because I'd like to rather spend more time talking about the ideology and stuff, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that suits me perfectly.
Mm.
Well, unlike a lot of the other detransitioners that are speaking out just now,
Mm.
I adopted the trans identity as an adult. So I
Mm.
wasn't like, a high school kid that got wrapped up in the social contagion aspect of it.
Mm.
So I picked up the trans identity when I was 20 or 21. I came out to friends and family and started the social transition when I was 22. I started the testosterone injections when I was 24. I got the double mastectomy when I was 26, and I detransitioned, stopping the testosterone when I was 28.
Okay, so when you so I mean, there was a little bit of a time lag there because I mean, a couple of people I've spoken to, or a couple of other people I've heard talk about it. I mean, they were getting hormones sometimes the same day.
Yeah,
So that gap that you had, was that more for uh were you getting therapy, or was it from your end, or was it also counselors and other people saying, okay, we got to maybe explore other avenues, or how is that working?
it was largely due to the waiting list. So
Okay.
you can self-refer here. You don't need a doctor to refer you. So I called up the Sandyford Gender Clinic in Glasgow and referred myself onto their waiting list in 2014. They told me that the waiting list was going to be roughly 12 to 13 months, during which time there's no mandatory therapy or anything like that. So you just kind of need to wait to get your appointment call. So I got the appointment call in early 2015, and after a couple of evaluation appointments, I got the testosterone injection that summer.
Okay. So once you got the evaluation, it goes kind of quickly. Now,
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, I'd like to talk a bit about the ideology, but I don't know if this is wrapped up in it or how that works, because like if you have to wait 12 to 14 months, or that time period, but at the same time, they're saying, okay, if you don't help kids transition, they're going to commit suicide, or things like that. Like, wouldn't at least it behoove them to offer some form of counseling in that time period? I mean, I'm just curious because I mean, it could be an other underlying issue. It could be depression. It could be something, or it could, be dysphoria. It could be any but like, why wouldn't they want to at least look at the mental health of the person who's asking for it?
Honestly, I think it's just because they don't have the staff or the resources, because there's been such a massive surge in the
Mm-hmm.
number of people, specifically women and girls, referring themselves to the clinic. They, I I can't possibly imagine how they would be able to have so many therapists and counselors free, because there's thousands and thousands of people now on these lists, whereas it used to just be hundreds. So over the past, what would it be? Maybe 5 to 6 years, maybe a little more, maybe over the past 7 years, it's absolutely exploded. So I don't really think it's negligence necessarily on their part. I think they've just been completely blown over by how much more common this has become.
Okay, so kind of going with that. So the ideology, like, now, I got into talking about a lot of this stuff, like, call it whatever you want, woke. I don't care about the name, um, on the race aspect,
Hmm.
and it was just purely because I was being called a white supremacist for criticizing Islam.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, well, I'm not white, so there's a bit of a problem there. And then I just wanted to know where that came from, and that was it. But along the way, I mean, I read some Judith Butler, I read some Gil Rubin, I read a couple of papers here and there. One thing that always kind of trips me up is like the trans activism seems to be coming more from like the queer theory side of things than gender theory. And it just seems to me gender theory would be where that would emanate from, just because, I mean, they changed women's studies to gender studies, or, like things like that. So like, how do the two work together, and, or am I kind of seeing this the wrong way?
I mean, they used to work together. I remember, when I was first like identifying as trans back in like 2012, 2013, I was on like a transition board, and the vast majority of the trans people there called themselves transsexual rather than transgender. They
Mhm.
acknowledged that you can't change sex. They didn't say you can't talk about periods or you'll offend the trans women. And then now it's completely went out the window, where the idea of queer theory and queer identities are so hostile to women especially, but men as well. Just you can't talk about men's issues and women's issues because that erases trans women and trans men, or you need to acknowledge that trans women are actually women. Which I don't mind them doing that, because it's pissing more people off and making people start to stand up and say, look, this whole queer thing you're doing, it's bullshit. Um, and we're not going to sit by and be polite anymore.
Okay. It just, because like I said, it just seems just logically, and I know it kind of seems weird because, on the surface of it, there's not a lot of logic to this stuff, but logically, you would think it would come from the gender theory. But that whole queering, now, again, maybe I'm wrong off this. If I read things like intersectionality, that's looking at how you've been oppressed and how your oppressions interlock and the way you can see the world. And but they specifically don't want to dismantle that racial identity that was imposed by them, on them by cis hetero white men or whatever, like the whole thing. But whereas in the queer and the gender, it is again a type of intersectionality, but it's how, not how you've been oppressed, but how you are oppressing. So they want to get completely rid of that identity. So like, it's like I see that coming from the queer side. So when when they say, okay, we need to queer this, like people, it's basically to problematize it, right? But is that where the friction with the gender side comes from? It is like they want to completely erase all genders, so that's where the gender theory or the women's studies or whatever, that's where the friction with the queer theory stuff comes in, or is that, am I wrong on that?
Well, that's where they get hypocritical, because when they do say, you can't say mother, you need to say birthing parent, and you can't say women's studies, you say queer studies and things like that. But on the other hand, they'll also insist that trans women are women and trans men are men and things like that. So it's like, do you want to abolish gender, or do you want it to continue to be acknowledged, but as long as it fits how you want to describe it and acknowledge it? Because it's weird. You can speak to two different people who are on that side of it and get two completely different opinions from them. Saying we shouldn't be saying mother and father anymore. We should just be saying parents. And then on the other hand, you have them saying we should be calling trans women who have children mothers and trans men who have children fathers. It's like, I'm not entirely sure exactly what you want anymore.
Okay, I mean, I joke around with it. I said it's like, because one of my friends asked me like, well, how does this stuff work? And I'd be like, okay, you remember that there was a episode of The Simpsons where like Ned Flanders' house gets destroyed, and his house is the only one that gets destroyed, and he's like out in the woods. He's like, God, I've done everything in the Bible, everything the Bible says, even the stuff that contradicts the other stuff. And I mean, like that's like kind of like perfect for this. But again, with this stuff, I mean, so I'm a 70s and 80s kid. Like I was a teenager in the 80s. And even back then, I remember it had started where it didn't matter if a little boy played with a doll or a little girl played with a truck. That's just a boy or a girl playing with a toy. That was it. Like there was, and it was, to get away from that idea of this is a male toy or a female toy or whatever, get away from those ideas. But now with this stuff, it's if a little boy wants to play with a doll, all of a sudden, okay, you're a girl, and we got to get you, on or puberty blockers or something. I don't know. And I'm seeing it younger and younger and younger. I mean, that's another one of those contradictions. I mean, why can't you just be a boy that whatever wants to wear a dress or plays with toys, or a girl that likes to roughhouse and plays with trucks or whatever? I mean, like, why is that a bad way to express your masculinity or femininity?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the rare sort of times where I will use the woke tactic of throwing out isms at people. It's because a part of it is deeply sexist and deeply homophobic. Because there was a whistleblower who came out recently about the Tavistock, which is the big gender clinic for children in England, who said, and this was a gay psychotherapist that had worked there, said that basically they were running a gay conversion therapy centre for kids because a lot of the kids that were being brought in were gender non-conforming, had issues with sexuality, and the parents basically would rather a straight trans girl than a gay son. And so when you see things like, oh, the little boy likes a doll and likes dresses, you can't just let him be a little boy that likes dolls and dresses. He must be a girl, because either there's the fear that, oh, he likes the dolls, I don't want a gay son, or it's just the plain old sexism of you're not meeting the gender stereotypes, therefore there's something wrong with you and we're going to take you to a clinic to get treatment. It's really dark when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I'm concerned about it. I don't have kids. I'm not a parent. I have, a niece and a nephew. But I'm concerned about it. Like, okay, I'm going to be kind of a little cold here, but I'm concerned about it in the way of, okay, it's getting into biology departments in universities. It's getting into med schools. When I'm retired, and I want my doctors to know biology. I'm like, in one sense, I'm being very pragmatic about this. And I'm being selfish. I want to look after myself. Like, what I mean? But I you're an adult. You did, you transitioned as an adult, and I'm like, fill your boots, do whatever you want, as long as you're not harming anyone else. Like, I don't care,
Yeah.
you know. Um, but like this forcing of a new reality, and like I said, it's getting into hospitals, it's getting into things like that. I'm like, that's what gets me a little worried about this. It's like, okay, I'm not going to argue with anyone who's an adult, but like when you start giving it to little children, when you're changing, definitions, when you're changing definitions of the word woman, there's a lot of the stats, we can get into that later, but like that, I just don't get that. Like where, like that impetus. I mean, I obviously you might not know, but we're doctors and therapists, and they're just going along with this. Like where's that coming from? Like, again, is this just imbibing ideology, or is this being pushed from somewhere else, or how does that work?
Well, my feel when because I've spoken to therapists and counselors
Mhm.
who were very uncomfortable when I brought up transition regret and things like that. And the sense that I got from some of them was this person is ideologically captured. They're not looking at me as a patient to treat. They're now looking at me as a threat to their beliefs because I'm no longer the perfect little trans person that they wanted to be. But on the other hand, I have had messages on my Twitter from therapists and things like that who've said, I follow you and I agree with what you're saying and stuff like that. But if I was to say this at my place of work, it would jeopardize my job.
Maybe it's easy to say. If you're a doctor, I mean, your oath is first do no harm. And if you're seeing harms done, I mean, doesn't something, okay, like in Canada, where, so we just had Bill C6 pass. I don't know if you follow that or not, or so it comes under the heading of anti-conversion therapy. So right away you think of, like, electrodes onto gay people and all that. And it has that in there, but it it also has for gender ID, and it says the only care that they can get is affirming care. So, and they have to affirm the new identity of, of the person who's transitioned. So if you were to go in and say, I'm having problems transitioning, or or I want to detransition, or I want to, or I want to stop, like, I want to stop the hormone therapy, or they would look at, there's some who are expressing concern about this, but it's like they would look at, like, why are you internalizing transphobia and things like that? Like, they're not, it's kind of forcing them to stick with like the like they have to affirm the new gender identity. They can't. It's like they're worried that they can't even you know entertain the idea that this person might have some other underlying issues. They want to transition back. Like, I mean, how much harm is that going to do to people? Like, I mean, if you hadn't been able to detransition, like, I mean, I don't. Sorry, and if this is getting too personal, like, it's I don't want to push it, but like, if you hadn't, you wanted to detransition, but if you weren't getting that kind of help, like, I mean, like, what would you have to like? Are you then forced to live some way you don't want to live? Like, I don't get that either. Sorry.
I mean, it strongly depends on how far you went with the legal change. So I was able to just stop my testosterone, and that was fine. Um, I was able to change all of my legal documents, bar my birth certificate, because I didn't bother getting the gender recognition certificate because I didn't need it because I got all my driver's license, my passport, and all that changed. But I have spoken to several detrans women who did get the recognition certificate, and they've went to their doctors and they've said, I regret transition, I want to detransition. And they've basically been told, well, you need to have a lived experience as your birth sex before we can legally allow you to return to your birth sex. But if you're going to do affirmation only, technically that wouldn't be possible because that wouldn't be affirming to the trans identity. I mean, I've spoken about the whole conversion therapy thing before. There was a survey done by Post Trans, and among the things that were seen as factors into why they initially identified as trans in the first place, I mean, you had abuse, you had trauma, you had eating disorders, you had they'd been bullied and they'd sort of found refuge in online trans spaces and then picked up the trans identity. You've got the social contagion. There's depression, anxiety. You've got all of these factors that have and will continue to lead people into trans identity. But if that's not going to be discussed in explorative psychotherapy at the clinics because it's conversion therapy, it's going to massively harm thousands of young people because you're putting them down an irreversible medical pathway. And I have to tell you, when you detransition and regret all that, and you just kind of stand there and you're like, why on earth did they allow me to inject cross-sex hormones and get on that surgeon's table without even bothering to ask if there was some other things going on and doing some exploratory therapy? That's astounding.
I want to kind of tie this in with something else. It's just when you started transitioning. Now, I'm going to equate this to a religion. Now, when people convert to Islam, they're praised. Oh, look at this! It's and they're showered with love and blah blah blah. And if that person then becomes an apostate, because usually it's about 5 years. If they're going to leave, they leave within the first 5 years, and otherwise they're in for good. Then they're vilified and they're derided, and it's all kinds of. I mean, apostates have a death threat on them in 13 countries because it's illegal, right? Like it's so. What was your experience like when you said, "Okay, I'm going to transition"? I mean, there's the family and friend side of things, but like from within like the trans community, like because I want to try to equate this to a religion or a cult, or because it has a lot of similarities.
They're very
So
similar, yeah.
yeah. So within the trans community, like what was like from transitioning to detransitioning, what was that reaction like?
Well, I was a bit of a unique case because even when I was trans, I was classed as true scum. So, I even when I was trans, I opposed giving puberty blockers to children. I acknowledged that you couldn't change sex and stuff like that. So the trans community, like the woke side of it, really wasn't fond of me even when I was trans. I was like a heretic then, and now I'm an apostate, so they hate me even more. But I've spoken to a lot of other detrans women, including Helena, who I'm sure you've
Yeah.
spoken to,
Yeah.
where they will say, when I was identified as trans and regurgitating the ideology, I was beautiful and I was brave and I could do no wrong. And then the minute I sort of put my hand up and said, I think I'm dealing with some transition regret. It was like, you traitor, you were never really trans, you're a liar, you're using your experiences to harm trans people because you're weaponizing your regret and all this. Like, the hostility is something that, unless you see it for yourself, you wouldn't believe. Just the vitriol that a lot of trans activists have for apostates like me.
Yeah, but like something like that. Now, okay, ex-Muslims get the same thing. You were never really Muslim, this or that. Like, and I can see it in some ways. Like if you were born into a family that's nominally Muslim and you never really practice it, that's yes, you were born into it, and that's whatever. Like, but someone who actually goes out and gets hormones, and or gets surgery done and then regrets it and wants to go back, like to say that you were never really trans, like, I mean, what, you were just doing that on a lark? I, you know, again, that's real inconsistency, because if you can decide what your identity is, then why is it so bad that you've changed your mind?
Well, because I get that a lot, quite regularly. Every time I'll
Mhm.
put something out, and there's always some tip that pops up, and it's like, well, it's because you were never really trans. And my response to that is always, well, if I was never really trans, then we have to admit that there's a fault in the clinics, because I was diagnosed by a professional who evaluated me, who then referred me for medical intervention. So if I was never really trans and that wasn't picked up by the professionals evaluating people, then we need to admit that there's the need for reform in these clinics if they're misdiagnosing and mistreating people. They never like it when I say that, but it's my go-to response.
Yeah, I know, but it's the truth hurts sometimes, I guess. But like in this with children, like you mentioned, Helena, and I'd spoken to her, and I've seen some of the detransition stories, and then someone like Kira Bell, like with the children. Now, again, adults do whatever you want. You're an adult, fill your boots. When I see like a 5,000% increase in girls transitioning, I'm like, okay, doesn't that kind of like ring some alarm bells somewhere? Or so what's kind of going on with it? Because you'd mentioned social contagion, and so like what's going on with that? Like, I mean, I see it in the schools now, like more and more they're starting a younger age, but I mean, there's a lot of it online as well. So like, what's again, if you don't mind getting a bit of that, like the grooming, basically.
Mhm. I mean, it's difficult to sort of pinpoint one thing because it's so complicated. But among the stories of like the detransitioned women and some of the trans men that I've spoken to, as to what kind of led to their trans identification, um, a few things crop up repeatedly. Things like, I didn't have many friends, so I turned to the internet, and so I ended up going down these rabbit holes, and I found the LGBT community on places like Tumblr, and then I started reading the blogs, and I just got pulled into it and adopted the identity that I thought would make me the most respected and loved and admired within my new group of friends, like my glitter family, as they call it. So it tends to be young, lonely people who, you're young, you want attention, you want to feel valued, you want to feel cool and special. There's no more cool or special or, trendy identity for young girls and women right now than being trans. And again, I say that as someone that I wasn't a trans teenager, but I speak to dozens and dozens of D-trans women, and I've got a lot of trans friends as well. And they're like, yeah, there's a difference between someone who has gender dysphoria from a very young age, and it haunts them consistently from the minute they're able to speak and articulate that they feel this way, and a teenage girl who was a perfectly normal teenage girl until she hit 14, found some online forums, and suddenly now she's a trans man called Jacob who wants testosterone and her breasts cut off. Like, that, you can't say that those are the same things. It's definitely social contagion, and a large part of it is because of social media.
Yeah. Now, like one thing you mentioned there, okay, these kids are lonely or feel disenfranchised, that kind of thing. Now, with the race stuff, and I said it, I said, look back to the gangs in the '80s, because I mean, you had the huge explosion of like the gangs in the mid and late '80s in the states, And then as a counter to that, you had a lot of skinhead and white supremacist groups. I mean, it's basically all just fighting for drug tariff rate. But it was when you listen to the police or you listen to the like the gang specialists or whatever they were, they go to high schools, they find the kids who are loners, they find the kids who feel like they're bullied, they find the kids who lack purpose or whatever, and they give them belonging. Now, I've been saying this stuff about the race stuff. Like, if you go into, because I've followed up on it, and like starting in about 2010 in the U.S., it was in some high schools in like the progressive states like New York and California and Washington, places like that. But it wasn't very ubiquitous. But it was still in some high schools, and it was teaching who's oppressed, who's oppressor. These people have kept you down. There was one school in New York City in 2015, starting in the third grade, 45 minutes a week. They would take kids, separate them by race, tell all the races, like the brown kids, the Latino, like the black kids, the Latino kids, the Asian kids. Um, Here's all the great things people from your race have done. You've been oppressed. White people have been holding you down. They told the white kids that your race has done all these awful things like in slavery and blah 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 blah, and you've been oppressors. And this is third grade children, right? So 8 years old maybe, and 45 minutes a week. Within a couple of months, all the kids started turning into ethno-nationalists because they started going online checking into like, hey, what's great about being white, what's great about being black, what's great, and like they just started, and the white kids started spouting like KKK stuff. I'm like, I was like, okay, you're creating a smorgasbord for gangs and extremists of any type to pick these kids off. So when you're getting that, especially now, like I said, they're starting it from kindergarten, where they're talking about who's oppressing who, and like, and then you especially get it for women, that just because you're women, you're automatically oppressed. You're going to get 22 cents less on the dollar, and like all 1 in 5 of you is going to get raped, and blah 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 blah, like all these things that go out. So aren't you, like, in my mind, the schools are conditioning the kids to go online and find these places because they are creating a larger number of kids that are going to be disenfranchised and feel set upon and want to be loners and think everyone's out to get them because that's what the schools are telling them.
Yeah, they're basically getting these kids while they're very young and getting them addicted to the victimhood mentality. Like, oh, woe is you, you're such a victim, look how terrible you've had it and stuff like that. So, you have a right to have a chip on your shoulder. And there's nothing's good is going to come from it. Like, as you said, you're going to split all these kids up by race and tell all of the other races that, the white people are evil and all that. And then the little white kids are like, I haven't done anything wrong, but I'm being treated badly. So I'm going to go on Google, and before you know, you've created a little Nazi, right? Like, that doesn't surprise me that could happen. So whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's religion, like, pick your poison, whatever it is, we really shouldn't be putting it in the face of children when they're that young, and dividing them up into groups. I mean, because, I'd call me crazy, but I would imagine the best thing to do to fight racism would be to get kids of all races in a room and say, play with one another and have a good time and become friends with one another. And then you'll see that race really doesn't make a person.
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, with either if it's the race stuff or the gender stuff, the hyper focus on identity is ruining everything. I mean, you can't you can't have a conversation about anything without either race or gender coming into it. I mean, you can talk about what a nice, lovely, sunny day it is, and I'm sure someone's going to bring one of those two topics into it. Like,
clearly, you've never been in one of the cold countries that are winter all the time. Because like, that's the thing. Like, when I came out as like a detransition and all that, like, a lot of the feminists came to sort of pat me on the back and be like, don't worry, we've got you and stuff. And I'm hugely grateful for that support and stuff like that. But they weren't very happy when I said, I don't I don't think I'm oppressed and I don't believe in patriarchy. Not in this country, maybe in places like Saudi Arabia, certainly, but
Yeah.
I don't think the UK is a patriarchy and I don't believe in rape culture and all of that stuff. Um, but it's not just that I don't believe in it. I don't think it's helpful to think like that because if you're a young woman and you're being told, you're a victim and you're being oppressed and you're probably going to have all these terrible things happen to you and be taken advantage of and not make as much money.
Yeah.
um, I can imagine it wouldn't be too difficult for a young woman to go, well, what's the point in trying then? It's such a depressing victimhoody, pointless way of thinking to me.
Yeah, no, the whole victimhood thing just drives me crazy. I want to touch on something you'd mentioned earlier, like you was talking about the gender clinics and like, okay, I can have a trans daughter instead of a gay son type of thing. Now, it's just because like places like Code Pink and Pink News, Law Iran, and then now recently Pakistan as well. Oh, they provide free transitions, surgeries. It's like, well, yeah, it's get the surgery or die.
Yeah.
I mean, but now this is a very rare thing. I don't want to like try to make it sound like this is common or whatever, but I have heard rumblings of things like that from very fundamentalist Christian groups in the states, where it's better to have a trans child than it is to have a gay child.
Mhm.
And I mean, like they're expressly saying that. So, like, because you'd mentioned that before, like, I mean, is that I don't want to even try to guess where Code Pink and Pink News are coming from, but is that kind of like, are you seeing any of that? Or, I mean, like, again, I have no idea, but like, because you'd mentioned it, I'm just curious, like, is that something that's even slightly common or?
I couldn't tell you how common it is because, to my knowledge, there's never been anyone actually looking into it. But if you read the Care Quality Commission report that investigated the Tavistock, they got access to a bunch of files, which they were examining and finding out just how little evidence and data were being collected by the clinic. But they noted that in nearly every single file that they checked, there was notes by clinicians saying that they had a concern that homophobia had a role to play in this, whether it was coming from the parents or whether it was being experienced by the kid. And I can't remember his first name, but the doctor I mentioned earlier, Dr. Bristow, he was he worked there for years and he outright came and said, I couldn't work there anymore because from what I saw, it felt like we were running a gay conversion camp. So, I mean, maybe it's just in the Tavistock. I don't know how it is in
Yeah.
America, but yeah, I mean, come on. If you've got parents who freak out when their little boy picks up a Barbie doll and says that must make he's a girl, we're going to pretend that that might not have some homophobia in it. Because we all know, like, you know, the old joke that used to be made where back when we were allowed to enjoy politically incorrect jokes, the son played with a dollhouse or something like that. The father's like, "Oh God, my son's gay." Like, I do think there's some of that in there. It really wouldn't surprise me.
On the parent side of thing, again, and this is, some of the stuff I've read and some of the things I've seen, like would you rather have a live daughter than a dead son or vice versa? Like the suicide thing, like the suicide rate doesn't seem to change much after transition, or
No, it doesn't.
is that again just playing on the fears of parents, or what's going on with that?
Well, I can give you my personal example of that. Prior to finding online stuff, I wasn't suicidal because I couldn't transition. That's just ridiculous. But you spend enough time in these spaces, you pick up the common trends and what people say. So when I saw everyone else saying, transition saved my life and I wouldn't be here without it, I used to say that. I never really believed it. It was just something that I picked up. And I remember roughly 2016, 2017, I was telling everyone in my life, transition saved my life and I probably would have killed myself had I not been able to do it. That wasn't true. But if you say it, you're convincing yourself that you have done the right thing. Because if you had to transition, you had to be allowed to transition, you've not made a mistake and everything's going to be great because it's a life-saving treatment. So, you know, it's very, very common to see that being talked about in trans online spaces. So you pick that up very quickly. How many of them actually believe it is doubtful to me, or dubious rather.
Is it just like kids picking up mantras online and then just saying them enough that it becomes like an automatic response type of thing, and they're not thinking beyond that? Or are they discouraged to think beyond that?
It's I wouldn't go so far as to say that they're going online and finding scripts, but if they read blogs and watch vlogs, they will pick up the often repeated phrases. And I'll take you back to the Tavistock scandal because I'm very pissed off with it right now. But one of the things that was noted by the clinicians was a lot of the children who were turning up appeared to be rehearsed in what they said. So they were getting a lot of children who never met one another. They're from completely different parts, um, and coming to the clinic, and they're saying the same sentences. They're saying, I've always felt this way. I've always known deep down something was wrong. And I hate myself so much because I know that my brain is different from my body. And if I don't get the blockers or the hormones, then I'm going to kill myself. And it's like when you have so many children, because there's almost 5,000 on the waiting list at the Tavistock. When you've got so many kids basically saying the same things verbatim, that's not genuine. They're learning that online.
Let's take the identity. So, when if you say that trans women should not be competing for the New Zealand team in the Olympics, you're committing a genocide on the trans identity. And with the religion thing as well, if I criticize Islam, it's like I'm criticizing a Muslim because they are their religion, right? Like it's very, very closely tied with their identity. But yet at the same time, like, I mean, you exist, you're here, Helena exists, I've spoken to them, I've seen, like there's Kira Bell, I can, see the stories on Twitter, but then they deny that you exist. They literally say there's no such thing as detransitioners. I mean, we had a Canadian politician during the, I don't know, the hearings or whatever before Bill C6 got passed, and he was a member of parliament, and he said straight out, "Oh, detransitioners are just a right wing myth." Again, like, how does that work with your identity? And they tie everything so closely with their identity, but yet they're just so easy to throw out that, oh, you don't, there's no such thing as a detransitioner.
Yeah, I mean, another something very similar to that was Dr. Jack Turbin, who basically came out in an interview that he did with the Gender GP podcast and basically said detransition doesn't happen, but when it does happen, it's because of transphobia and that they will retransition later. They don't actually regret their transition, they're detransitioning because of how transphobic society is. And I've reached out to him, and a lot of detransitioners that I know have reached out to him, and he's just ignoring us because people like Jack Turbin, Dr. Jack Turbin, cannot acknowledge that transition regret is possible because it's going to open up the window of how much harm their endorsement of affirmation only has done. So the hostility to detransitioners comes from a very specific place, and it comes from if we have to acknowledge that maybe we shouldn't have been transing very young children. Maybe we shouldn't have been telling teenagers that they should start taking blockers or cross-sex hormones, or taking 20-year-old women to get their breasts cut off. If they acknowledge the growing number of detransitioners, the people in that field are going to have to accept responsibility for what they've done, and they don't want to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that, like, I'm thinking about this and I'm just saying, okay, when people do finally come to their senses, and I hope it happens sooner than later, the amount of lawsuits that are going to be coming, and I mean, deservedly so. Like, these doctors need to be put out of business. But it's going to make like the repressed memory thing look like nothing.
Yeah,
You know,
because the other example that I found really interesting was the multiple personality craze
yeah.
that took place. What did they used to call it? No, it's now called DID. Used to be called multiple personality disorder, but it specifically affected young women in the form of social contagion. And that's exactly what this is, except at an even grander and more harmful scale.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. Now, for parents, now, like, little kid comes home and whatever, maybe they heard it in school, saw it online, says, "Mommy, Daddy, I am no longer a boy, I'm a girl," or whatever. And if a parent, like, now obviously like parents want to help their, most rational, normal, parents want to make sure their kids are okay and they're healthy. And so when their kid comes to them and says something like that, are there options or just any, like, will the majority of therapists just give them the one thing of, okay, well, you can start, I do affirmation therapy, you can start on puberty blockers, like that kind of stuff. Like, are there options for parents to go look at other places?
I think there is, but they're very difficult to find. Like I get messages from parents all the time, and I always just refer them to Stella O'Malley's organization and to GenSpec because they are specifically set up to advise the parents of trans children. So there are places that they can go, but if they were, for example, here in the UK, if they were to go to an NHS GP, they would only recommend taking the kid to a gender clinic. Whereas if they go to the gender clinic, that's affirmation only because God forbid they take part in conversion therapy. So if you have a child who has experienced rapid onset gender dysphoria, so you're fairly confident that you don't have a trans kid, that something else is going on, don't take them to a gender clinic. Do not take them to a gender clinic because the gender clinic will affirm. You need to find another therapist or counsellor that is not attached to the gender clinic who will give a more neutral investigation into what's going on with the kid.
Yeah, I mean, here it's like, I don't know what's going to happen because Bill C6 just passed, but in Ontario, they've had a law on the books for a few years now, and they changed the family, like the Family Care Act or whatever, but like the family law stuff. And so if parents don't affirm the gender of the child, the state can take the child away. Now, the most egregious case I've heard of this was an autistic kid who was in first grade, so really young, went to a new school, walked into the wrong washroom. When he came out, there was just a school official there. I don't know if it was administrator or teacher or whatever. And they said, "Oh, what do your parents think that you're a girl now? And, or do you tell your parents you're a girl or something along those lines?" And the kid said, "Why would I do that? That would get them mad." And like I said, keep in mind, this kid is autistic. The, the, the province took the kid away for 3 days.
God, that's every parent's worst nightmare, isn't it? Jesus.
Yeah. But I mean, but okay, I'm not talking about like fundamentalist parents who would, if the child's gay or whatever, or beat them, do whatever. I'm not talking, but like average everyday parents who, I mean, Ibram X. Kendi, Mr. Woke himself, said it. Like, I don't know if you saw the interview where he was talking about it, and he said, if, I think he said, "My little girl came home one day and said she was a boy, and I was horrified."
Mm-hmm.
Or he, I don't know if he said that she did, or if she comes to me and says this, I would be horrified, something along those lines. And because he's talking about his 5-year-old daughter, and like, I, you know, parents want to look after their kids. So if their son or their daughter comes to them and says, I'm no longer a girl, or I'm no longer a boy, like, parents are going to want to take care of their kids. Sorry, again, like I said, I ramble.
That's okay. Like to me, like when I had, again, kind of different because I was an adult, but as my dad said, you'll always be my little girl. And when I spoke to my mum and dad, when I had to sit them down and say, I've made a huge mistake and I'm going to detransition. My dad was very, very much against my transition. He was the one member of the family that was like, I will never have a son and I'm not playing along with this. He didn't cut me out or anything. He's a very, very loving man, but he wasn't playing along with anything. And when I sat them down and I explained to them that I was detransitioning, what they'd said to me was, it didn't bother us that you were identifying as a man. It bothered us that you were going to be going through irreversible medical treatments with a lot of risks and side effects. So, I mean, because when I told them, they looked up what testosterone can do to a female body. They looked up the risks that can come with trans surgeries. So they didn't care how I was identifying. Parents are generally just really concerned with how horribly wrong some transitions can go. I mean, especially now you've got Buck Angel making more people aware of things like atrophy. that can be fatal. So no parent wants their kid to go through stuff like that.
Okay, with this, like, if you wouldn't mind talking about some of the dangers, like, because again, I keep seeing it. Oh, you can always stop the puberty blockers. You can, the kids can go get off it, and it'll be reversed. And I heard one woman just, I think she was a doctor. She just said it straight out that, oh, who cares if they get a mastectomy? They can have their boobs put back on later. It's like,
Yeah, I saw that.
I mean, like, so callously talking about young girls like that. I don't get it.
Yeah, I mean, I have to tell you, man, I don't want some silicone shit on my chest. I would like my healthy, natural chest back, but that's never going to happen. So I'll stick with being flat for now. But I mean, yeah, the risks that I was informed of was that, taking testosterone, it can give you a higher, in females, it can give you a higher risk of heart attack. It can affect your cholesterol. It can affect your mood, so it can make you more angry, more aggressive. You might engage in more risky behavior, and things like that. But I was never told about atrophy. Specifically, that's what Buck Angel had, and it nearly killed him. So if you are a biological female taking testosterone, it's recommended that roughly about 5 years into that, you should get a hysterectomy. Otherwise, you can be at risk of atrophy. That never came up once at my clinic. I had no idea what that was until I saw Buck Angel talking about it. And most of the other trans men that I knew at the time had never heard of it either. So we know that there's probably other things that could be a side effect that we still don't know yet, and we'll find out about it the first time some poor trans person is the example of that. And for the puberty blockers, I mean, the NHS here in the UK has had to come out and admit that they don't know what the long-term effects are, and they don't know what effects puberty blockers have on children's brains or bones, which was why in the Keira Bell case, they were referred to as experimental treatments. So, I mean, they might not be dangerous in that they're not going to kill you, but they're going to affect your brain development. They're going to affect your bone density. If you're going to be maturing at a slower pace than your peers, it's going to affect your social life. And I am loath to think some of the other things that might do to a child that isn't experiencing precocious puberty, because puberty is important. It's how we move from children to adolescence and learn to grow up physically and mentally. So pausing puberty isn't just, oh, it's fine, it's just a pause button. No, you are stopping a natural, healthy process, and you will be damaging the child in the process when you do that.
That's the thing. I still don't, I can't wrap my head around, like, how would, like, this capture of the medical profession and therapy, how does that come about where I'm still trying to figure, like I said, wrap my head around this. Like, how are doctors who are supposed to do, first do no harm, giving things to kids that it's going to cause harm? I mean, if they give you puberty blockers and you're a female and you don't get proper estrogen, your bones aren't going to harden. And then, like, is that like, just osteoporosis? You're going to get that earlier than you should. I mean, things like that. Like, it's just, and it sounds like a minor thing, but it could lead to some serious problems later on. I mean, like, I still don't know where that complete takeovers come from.
Well, we're also doing that with the knowledge that in the studies that have been done, if you take a bunch of kids and who have dysphoria and you go through watchful waiting, upwards of 80% of them will desist. So they don't need the puberty blockers. Leave kids alone. Like, as you were saying earlier, if you're an adult, do what you want. If we weren't doing this to children, this would not be an issue. You'd have the odd pissed off, feminist or whatever complaining about trans women in their bathrooms. But the reason why this has become a massive controversial scandal is because we are basically experimenting on children, and every decent person with a lick of empathy in them can see that this is wrong.
The washroom thing, someone's trans and they go into a washroom, like whatever, it shouldn't be a huge thing to, I don't think. But it's like, the self ID, and then you can go into whatever washroom you want. That's a bit of an issue, I think, or like the self ID and going into women's prisons. But, I think the sport thing, I think when people see it at the Olympics this year, they might actually, it might actually put it more into the spotlight. Like, this is completely unfair. Like, a biological male should not be competing against biological females.
Well, Laurel Hubbard is the best gift to our side, if you will, that we've ever had, because this is going to be on the world stage. Everyone is going to see this biological male dominate in the women's category. And like, I have enough faith in humanity as a whole that the whole thing is just going to be called out for what it is, and that is cheating.
Yeah, but I mean, again, like there are some places where I think you need women's only spaces. I mean, like there was those the swimming pools in London or just outside of London last year, the year before. Um, they had, I don't know why they were segregated. I can't remember, but so you had a women's only pool and a men's only pool, and then there were trans women going into the women's only pool, and there was like a bit of an uproar about it because some of them were self ID.
Mm.
Um, you know, like I said, like I think there needs to be some places that are female only. Um,
Yeah, I'm a little bit more liberal with that on some issues, like with the bathroom issue. I don't
yeah,
care. I go to the pub with my trans friends all the time, and they use
mm,
their preferred bathrooms, and there's never been an issue.
yeah,
But when it comes to things like prisons or rape crisis shelters or changing rooms where you are going to be naked or sports,
mm,
absolutely it needs to be segregated by sex and not gender, because sex is important when it comes to things like that.
yeah. I mean, okay, like the bathroom thing again. I think it's if you're in a pub, you're all adults, do whatever you want. I think in some public spaces, like okay, someone like here in Canada, Jessica Yaniv, who actually talked openly about approaching young girls in washrooms and asking them if they were on their period, and I mean, like, okay, you're a trans woman, you're not biologically female. Why do you need a tampon? Why are you going up to 13-year-old girls in the washroom and asking them for tampons? Like, that's a little creepy.
Yeah, like Jessica Yaniv is a man with a fetish. I'm not going to be courteous in that regard because he's a fucking creep. But I saw just before I came on to speak to you, a trans woman had posted. I can't remember exactly, but it was something along the lines of, for all you people feeling sorry that Britney Spears can't remove her IUD, you should also feel sorry for trans women because we want uterus implants, and it's the same thing. And it was like, see the trans women and their allies that are saying trans women can have periods and trans women should be able to have babies with uterus implants and all the rest of it. They are on their own going to destroy trans acceptance, because that's a whole different level of ridiculous.
Okay, on that, because this is one of the things I've kind of been harping about since I got back from overseas. Like, so I returned to Canada in February 2014. And I just started seeing all this stuff online. Like I said, especially came around about the race stuff, and then there was the gender gap and things like that, like the gender pay gap. Uh, I said, okay, you're going to have an overcorrection. I said, if you keep hyper focusing on race and racial identity, you're going to have a backlash. And I thought, Charlottesville would have been that backlash, and people would have woken up, but no, it's gotten even worse. Like, are you worried about an overcorrection? Like when you said, people, this is going to create hatred for the trans identity and trans community, and like I am seeing some of it. It's just an outright rejection of the idea of trans. And I mean, like, like I said, people are adults. Let adults be adults and let them do what they want. But are you worried about that? Like that overcorrection coming from, like, there is legitimate pushback against, the whatever the trans woman in New Zealand going to the Olympics. I mean, there is a legitimate pushback to things like that. But are you, like I said again, are you worried about it going too far and just complete rejection of like everything trans?
Yeah, I mean, I've got. I'm not so worried about my trans men friends because testosterone's a hell of a
Mm-hmm.
drug and they all pass very well.
Mm-hmm.
But I've got a couple of trans women friends who, they're completely harmless. They're wonderful people, but they don't pass very well. So when they use, like public bathrooms for this whole time, there's never been an issue. They go in, they do their business, they leave. That's perfectly fine. But I think if it gets to a point where the whole trans ideology thing has become so ridiculous that everyone gets really angry at it, I'm genuinely worried that my friends, and again, wonderful, completely harmless, wouldn't touch a fly, um, could potentially be targeted for being trans because of the anger that's going to be stirred up with all of this horseshit. Because listen, we should be criticizing Hubbard getting into the Olympics. We should be saying, no, a biological male does not belong in a female space. But it's getting to the point where it's so ridiculous, and the politicians and the activists have themselves to blame for allowing it to get this far. The average person who doesn't buy this is starting to say, I'm sick of this whole trans thing. I'm sick of every time I go online, Eddie Izzard has come out or Elliot Page has come out, and it's everywhere, and now it's Pride Month and I can't go to the fucking grocery store without there being trans flags flowing over it. And I really, hand on my heart, hope this does not have a backlash on trans people, because the vast majority of them are wonderful people just getting on with their lives. They're not the crazy activists. The crazy activists are ruining for everybody.
And that's the same thing in all of it, right? Like, yeah, there's problems with racism. Like I live in Canada, which is not an overtly racist, horrible place, but I face racism here. I'm not saying that there isn't problems, but when you start saying the Real Estate Association of Canada can no longer, I mean, this is one of the recommendations they put out to all the realtors in Canada. Don't no longer use the term master bedroom because it brings up ideas of slavery. I mean, it's,
oh God,
like, yeah. So like, oh no, it's stupid. Like it's worth laughing at, but like I said, if that's the level of where we have to get to find racism, can we at least agree that racism is being reduced quite a bit? Like if that's what you're going after, like I said, I admit there's issues, we got to fix them, but this stuff gets in the way, and I'm afraid of that backlash. Like especially now, there was a couple articles that had come out about a rising white identity, and it was also like in the American Psychiatry Association or American Psychology Association, where a larger number of white kids are identifying as white, which I'm like, okay, let's put a stop to that. Like, let's put a stop to everyone identifying with their skin color and all that. But it's just so like I'm terrified of like things like that. And same thing with this. Like it's just it's almost like they're taking a piss to see how far before they get punched in the face, and it just.
I mean, again, like with everything, it could be race, sexuality, gender, religion, all the rest of it. Everything has, sexist people exist, racist people exist, homophobic people exist. But when you start saying ridiculous things like our society is sexist, racist, and homophobic, and it needs to be reformed because the straight white man is the devil, like, it's so ridiculous, and it's actually distracting from the real problems. Because if you're going to say, oh, the white man is evil, or the heterosexual man is evil, it's like, it's more complicated than that. So if you're going to focus on this boogeyman, you're going to ignore all the other complicated factors that come into, well, why do you have the history that you have? Why were black people once treated like this, or brown people, or women, or gay people? And how the strides that we've made, how have we got to where we are? We didn't do it by pointing in people's faces and saying, you must accept me. We did it by showing, look, we are all equal and deserving of the same rights and all the rest of it. If I was to come up to you and threaten you with violence and say, you need to accept me as a detransitioner, in your head, you're going to be like, this bitch is crazy. But if I was, if I was to come up and I was say, I'm going to explain to you my story, I'm going to tell you what happened, and just let you know and be aware that there's this thing called detransition that exists. And so that'll put that in your head where you're like, well, it's something for it to be there, but I didn't have this horrible, threatening, aggressive experience with it, so I'm open to it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm rambling at you now.
No, that's fine. It's good. I was thinking about something you'd said earlier, and then like the corporate woke stuff. Now, I don't know if this is true or not, because I saw the picture on Twitter, so take this with a grain of salt. But it was supposedly like Skittles for Pride Month, and it was like the white rainbow.
Okay.
And it was like Skittles White Pride. I was just like, okay, that's just a little much.
This thing about Pride, I don't get it.
But did you see the Netflix? They're doing that new show now, the Queer Agents or something like that.
Oh, the like ridiculously over the top gay thing.
Yeah, but I'm like, again, that's like, okay, aren't you just taking a stereotype again and just, it's like, okay, you're going back to the stereotype of gay being camp and all that. Like,
One of the
you know,
characters is called Twink. I nearly pissed myself when I saw it. I was like, I need to show this to all my gay friends. And they were like, what the fuck is this? I'm like, it's a new show that's coming out. Are you going to watch it? And they were like, no. Like,
but I mean, it's again, this stuff is just okay. There was a show. There's another animated show, but it's called. They were taking like Big Brother,
oh, was it
and
Drawn
they
Together?
took yeah, Drawn Together. That was the one, and that one episode where they had the gay bash. I mean, like that was just. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, like that really stupid, really offensive type of humor is my type of humor.
Yeah. I just saw the trailer for this, but it doesn't seem much different than kind of what they were doing in that little, that little segment of that episode. It's just, I mean, if you want to make it like if you want to make it a parody, fine, it's a parody because some of this stuff needs to be. I mean, I keep saying this stuff needs to be ridiculed, but at certain points, like how much further can you go than what they're saying?
Yeah, like the funniest things that I've read on that side recently hasn't been coming from people joking about the woke crowd. It's the insanity that they will say, like the uterus thing, like trans women need uterus implants. And I'm like, that's some funny shit. Because listen, no sensible person will take that seriously. That's funnier than any joke that you or I could crack.
Yeah. Or there was that one yesterday about not misgendering cows or something.
Oh yeah, you can't put a gender identity onto animals because they can't tell you their gender when you're just assigned their sex at birth. And all that's bullshit. And because I responded to that and I was like, I completely agree. My cat was assigned female at birth, but we decided we weren't going to gender it, but then it went and shagged about and still got pregnant. So I don't understand when it didn't have a gender and everyone was like, you know, you if you can not take it too seriously, because a lot of people were like, I'm sick of this, you're denying sex-based rights and all that. And I was like, just don't take it seriously. Joke about it, find a way to laugh about it, because it's only going to get crazier until it dies down.
Yeah, no, it's just like I said, some of this stuff has gone a little too far. Look, I don't want to keep you too long. If you got any last words to say about like what people can do to think about this, or how you'd like to try to get their minds around this, please go ahead.
Um, I suppose what I would say is don't take either side too seriously. So if you are, I doubt there's any woke people listening to you, but humor me. If there's a woke person who thinks that the TERFs and the TERFs and the gender criticals and all that, all these horrible people, just take a little step back and say, not all of them can be. Some of them must have genuine concerns and go and find out what those are. And then on the other side, if you're looking at trans rights activists and their allies and things like that, and you're thinking they all just hate women and gay people. Some of them have genuine concerns, and there is a concern that there's room for us to be more accepting of trans people. We don't need to give up our sex-based rights. We don't need to give up our spaces. But gender dysphoria is a very horrible condition, and show compassion where appropriate.
Well, I like that little caveat. Well, thank you very much. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, I mean, if you're
And,
ever up for a chat, even about something unrelated to this, just let me know. I'm always up for a beer and a chat.
oh, for sure. And if you want to let people know where they can get a hold of you, like or your socials or anything like that.
Currently, I'm only on Twitter, so I'm Watson91, but I'm currently toying with maybe one YouTube video. So we'll see how that goes.
Great. Well, yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for listening.
Right, have a good day.